When five men cornered Judge Harrison Blackwell in Romano's that Tuesday night, he thought his money and status would save him, until the quiet woman refilling water glasses stepped forward with skills that would change both their lives forever. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's twist will leave you speechless. Tonight, a millionaire judge, 5 ruthless men, and a maid's hidden skill that shocked everyone. Let's begin. Judge Harrison Blackwell sat at the finest table in Romano's, the city's most exclusive restaurant, his untouched veal cooling in front of him. At 62, the millionaire judge was used to commanding courtrooms, but tonight he sat alone, checking his Rolex again and again. His dinner companion, a senator's wife interested in his judicial insights, had just canceled, and for the first time in years, the man who sentenced criminals to decades behind bars looked like the loneliest person in the room. Harrison's tailored Armani suit couldn't hide the weight he'd gained since Margaret's funeral 2 years prior, and his steel-gray eyes held the fatigue of a man who'd spent decades making life-altering decisions for others while neglecting his own life. The waiter had stopped asking if he needed anything after the 4th polite dismissal. Money bought him the finest table, the most expensive wine, the chef's personal attention, but it couldn't purchase the one thing his heart craved: genuine companionship. Across the restaurant's marble floor, past tables filled with animated conversations and clinking glasses, moved a woman most patrons never truly saw. Lucia Santos refilled water glasses with practiced precision, her movements economical and nearly invisible. At 38, she possessed the kind of quiet grace that came from years of perfecting the art of service, being helpful without being noticed, efficient without being intrusive. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her pressed uniform couldn't quite hide the intelligent alertness in her warm brown eyes. But tonight, those eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen entrance, where she'd glimpsed something troubling during her last trip to refill the ice bucket. 5 men in expensive suits had entered through the service corridor, not the main entrance where reservations were checked and coats were taken. She'd served enough powerful people to recognize the predatory energy that surrounded certain types of men, and these 5 radiated danger beneath their polished exterior. 20 years of invisible work had taught Lucia to observe, to piece together conversations overheard while clearing plates, to understand the undercurrents that wealthy diners never imagined their help could comprehend. She'd also learned to stay quiet, to keep her head down, to remember that her job and the health insurance it provided for her elderly mother depended on being nothing more than efficient hands that appeared when needed and vanished when dismissed. What none of them knew, what her simple uniform and soft-spoken demeanor concealed, was that Lucia Santos had once been Captain Lucia Santos of the Special Forces, decorated for valor in 3 overseas operations. The skills that had once made her invaluable to military intelligence now helped her navigate the complex social hierarchies of Manhattan's elite dining scene. She'd traded combat boots for service shoes, tactical awareness for emotional intelligence, but the core of who she was, a protector, a strategic thinker, a woman who acted when others froze, remained unchanged. Judge Blackwell signaled for his check, apparently ready to abandon his expensive meal and return to his empty penthouse overlooking Central Park. Lucia approached his table with the practiced smile that had become second nature. "Was everything to your satisfaction this evening, Judge Blackwell?" Her voice carried the slight accent of her Dominican heritage, softened by years of conscious effort to sound professional. He looked up, and for a moment, their eyes met directly. She expected the usual dismissive glance, the way most diners look through her rather than at her. Instead, she saw something unexpected, a flicker of genuine sadness, quickly masked by the professional courtesy of a man accustomed to public appearances. "The food was excellent as always, miss." He paused, realizing he'd dined here dozens of times without ever asking her name. Santos. Lucia Santos. She wasn't sure why she offered her first name. It wasn't protocol. "Thank you, Lucia. The service was impeccable." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just being polite. "I'm sorry I didn't finish much of it. It seems I've lost my appetite for dining alone." The honesty in his admission caught her off guard. She'd served hundreds of powerful men who wore their success like armor, who never acknowledged loneliness or vulnerability. But Judge Blackwell's carefully maintained facade had slipped just enough to reveal the isolation beneath. "Sometimes," she said quietly, stepping closer and lowering her voice, "the best meals are the ones we share with people who see us for who we really are, not what we've accomplished." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of chair legs scraping against marble. Lucia's peripheral vision caught movement. The 5 men from the service corridor were advancing across the restaurant with purposeful strides, their attention fixed on Judge Blackwell's table. Her military training kicked in instantly. She cataloged exits, assessed distances, evaluated threats. The way they moved, the bulges under their jackets, the coordinated approach, this wasn't a coincidental encounter. Judge Blackwell noticed her sudden tension. "Is something wrong?" Before she could answer, the lead man, tall, scarred, with the cold eyes of someone comfortable with violence, spoke from behind the judge's chair. "Judge Harrison Blackwell, you've made some powerful enemies with your recent rulings." Harrison's fork clattered to his plate as he turned, his face paling as he recognized the type of men who'd found him. These weren't courtroom protesters or disgruntled lawyers filing appeals. These were the kind of men who settled disputes with methods that never appeared in legal briefs. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Harrison began, his judicial composure cracking. "No misunderstanding," the scarred man replied, his 4 companions spreading out to surround the table. "You cost some very important people a lot of money. Time to pay up." The restaurant's ambient noise, conversations, clinking silverware, soft jazz, seemed to fade as the moment crystallized. Lucia felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she'd experienced in conflict zones, the hyper-aware state where time slowed and options calculated themselves in milliseconds. Judge Blackwell was about to discover that his money and status offered no protection against men who specialized in violence. And Lucia Santos was about to reveal skills that would forever change how both of them saw each other and themselves. The attack unfolded with brutal efficiency. The scarred man's hand shot out, gripping Judge Blackwell's shoulder with enough force to make him wince. "Stand up slowly, Your Honor. We're going to take a little walk to discuss your recent decisions regarding the Castellano construction contracts." Harrison's mind raced through recent cases, the corruption trial where he'd sentenced 3 city officials, the racketeering case where his rulings had frozen millions in assets. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. "Whatever grievance you have, this isn't the way to—" "Shut up." The second attacker, a compact man with prison tattoos creeping above his collar, pressed something hard against Harrison's ribs, through his jacket. "Judge or not, you bleed like everyone else." The restaurant's other patrons remained oblivious, absorbed in their own conversations. The maitre d' was busy seating a party of 8 near the entrance. The sommelier was presenting wine to a corner table. Life continued its elegant rhythm, while 5 men prepared to destroy a life in plain sight. Lucia Santos stood frozen for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to assess the tactical situation, identify weapons, and calculate angles of attack. The muscle memory of 100 training scenarios flooded back: hostile extraction, civilian protection, neutralizing superior numbers. Her pulse slowed rather than accelerated, her breathing deepened, and her mind shifted into the analytical calm that had once made her one of the military's most decorated special operations officers. "Move," the scarred man ordered Harrison, who struggled to stand on unsteady legs. That's when Lucia acted. "Excuse me, gentlemen." Her voice remained professionally polite, but she stepped directly into their formation, carrying a tray of water glasses with practiced ease. "The manager asked me to inform you that your table in the private dining room is ready." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. "Lady, Walk away. This doesn't concern you." "Of course, sir." She smiled apologetically, then stumbled slightly, sending the tray tilting toward the compact man with the weapon. He instinctively stepped back to avoid the spilling water, and in that split second of distraction, Lucia's true nature emerged. Her left hand snapped out in a precise strike to his wrist, deadening the nerves and causing him to drop the concealed knife. Her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus, folding him in half as air exploded from his lungs. The water glasses shattered against the marble floor with a crystalline crash that finally drew the attention of nearby diners. "What the hell?" The scarred man lunged toward her, but Lucia was already moving. 20 years of muscle memory guided her body through movements that seemed impossible for a woman in a server's uniform. She ducked under his reaching arms, swept his legs with a technique learned in Quantico, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the adjacent table. Judge Blackwell watched in stunned amazement as the quiet woman who'd been refilling his water glass transformed into something between a dancer and a warrior. She moved with lethal precision, every gesture economical and devastatingly effective. The third attacker drew a pistol, but Lucia had already closed the distance. She trapped his gun hand against his body while driving her knee into his thigh, hitting the pressure point that dropped him to one knee. A sharp blow to his wrist sent the weapon skittering across the floor under a nearby table. Have you ever witnessed someone reveal a completely different side of themselves in a crisis? Share a moment when someone surprised you with hidden strength. I'm curious about your experiences. Call the police. Harrison shouted to the restaurant staff, his voice finally breaking through his shock. Several diners were now standing, phones appearing as the situation escalated beyond anything Romanos had ever witnessed. The fourth and fifth attackers hesitated, clearly unprepared for resistance from what they'd assumed was harmless service staff. But their hesitation cost them the initiative. Lucia grabbed a wine bottle from the sommelier station, not to use as a weapon but to herded them toward the kitchen entrance where they'd originally appeared. "You have 10 seconds to leave the way you came," she said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that made both men step backward. "Or I start breaking bones." The scarred man struggled to his feet, blood trickling from where his forehead had met the table's edge. His eyes held a grudging respect, mixed with fury. "This isn't over, Judge. And you," he pointed at Lucia, "just made yourself a target." "I've been a target before." Her response was matter-of-fact, almost casual. "I'm still here." The 5 men retreated toward the service corridor, dragging their injured companion and casting venomous looks over their shoulders. The compact man with the deadened wrist nursed his arm, while the one who'd drawn the pistol limped slightly from Lucia's knee strike. As sirens wailed in the distance, the restaurant erupted into chaos. Waiters rushed to clear broken glass and overturned chairs. The maitre d' attempted to restore order while fielding calls from concerned corporate management. Other diners pulled out phones to record the aftermath, their evening's entertainment suddenly transformed into social media content. But Judge Harrison Blackwell only had eyes for Lucia Santos. She stood amid the wreckage of shattered crystal and upended furniture, her uniform slightly disheveled but her composure intact. Her brown eyes met his, and in that moment, everything he thought he knew about strength, about protection, about the invisible people who moved through his privileged world, shattered as completely as the water glasses on the marble floor. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice returning to its gentle professional tone as if she hadn't just neutralized 5 armed men with surgical precision. Harrison touched his shoulder where the scarred man had gripped him, but the ache was nothing compared to the upheaval in his chest. This woman, this quiet, overlooked woman he'd barely noticed, despite months of shared meals, had just saved his life with skills that defied everything he thought he understood about her. "Who are you?" The question escaped his lips as little more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a man whose entire worldview had just been reconstructed in the span of 3 violent minutes. Lucia's smile held secrets that stretched back decades, and for the first time in years, Judge Harrison Blackwell realized that his greatest education was about to begin. You just saw how one quiet maid changed everything when no one expected it. If her courage gave you chills, don't just sit back, show your support by hitting like and subscribing. That's how you keep stories like this alive. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights casting red and blue shadows through Romano's floor-to-ceiling windows. Detective Ray Martinez, a 20-year veteran with tired eyes and a rumpled suit, took statements while crime scene photographers documented overturned chairs and scattered glass. Judge Blackwell sat rigidly upright in his chair, his judicial composure restored like armor hastily reassembled. He answered questions with precise legal language, describing the attack in clinical terms that stripped away emotion and vulnerability. 5 individuals approached my table with apparent intent to intimidate or harm. The server, Miss Santos, intervened and they departed through the service entrance. Detective Martinez looked up from his notepad. Judge, witnesses say this woman took down 5 armed men like she was trained military or law enforcement. You sure you don't know anything more about her background? I know nothing beyond her professional service here, Harrison replied stiffly, avoiding Lucia's eyes across the restaurant, where she gave her own statement to another officer. The distance between them felt deliberate now, carefully maintained. What he couldn't admit, not to the detective, not to himself, was that Lucia Santos had terrified him. Not her violence, but her competence. The way she'd moved with lethal grace shattered his fundamental understanding of power and control. For 62 years, he'd believed his wealth, education, and position made him superior to people like her. 3 minutes of watching her work had revealed the comfortable fiction of that belief. Across the dining room, Lucia wrapped her arms around herself as she spoke to Officer Chen, a young woman who kept glancing at her with obvious admiration. Ma'am, where did you learn to fight like that? Officer Chen asked quietly. That wasn't self-defense class stuff, that was professional-level combat training. Lucia's jaw tightened. She'd spent 2 decades carefully constructing an identity that let her disappear into the background, becoming invisible and safe. Tonight had shattered that protection in front of dozens of witnesses, their phone cameras, and now police reports that would become public record. I took some martial arts classes years ago, she lied smoothly. Lucky adrenaline, I guess. The truth. Her military service, her decorated career in special operations, the circumstances that had forced her to abandon that life, remained locked away. Lucia Santos, the war hero, had died 8 years ago when she'd made a choice that cost her everything she'd worked for. Lucia Santos, the invisible maid, was all she had left, and now even that fragile identity felt compromised. The judge seems like a good man, Officer Chen continued, fishing for information. You two seemed close when we arrived. He's a customer, Lucia replied coldly, her professional smile returning like a shield. I serve his table when he dines here. That's the extent of our relationship. But even as she spoke, her eyes drifted toward Harrison, who was gesturing emphatically to Detective Martinez. The moment when their eyes had met after the attack replayed in her mind, the raw vulnerability in his expression, the way he'd looked at her not as invisible help, but as someone who mattered. For just an instant, she'd felt seen in a way that had been absent from her life for years. The feeling terrified her more than facing 5 armed men. When someone shows you a side of themselves they've kept hidden, does it bring you closer or make you pull away? I'd love to know your thoughts on unexpected revelations in relationships. Detective Martinez closed his notepad with a sharp snap. Judge Blackwell, I have to ask, any idea why these men targeted you specifically? The Castellano construction case you mentioned is still under appeal. Someone might be trying to influence your decisions. Harrison's expression hardened. Detective, I've presided over hundreds of cases involving organized crime, political corruption, and financial fraud. half of Manhattan's criminal enterprises would benefit from my disappearance. This could be connected to any number of ongoing investigations. We'll need you to consider enhanced security measures. Personal protection, modified routines, perhaps. Absolutely not. Harrison's voice carried the finality of a judicial ruling. I won't live my life cowering from threats. If I required protection every time someone disliked my legal decisions, I'd need a permanent army. The detective looked skeptical but nodded. Your choice, Judge. We'll patrol the area tonight. Keep an eye on your building, but you might want to reconsider dining alone in public places for a while. As the police finished their work and began clearing the scene, Harrison found himself stealing glances at Lucia, who was helping the restaurant staff restore order. She moved with the same quiet efficiency as always, but now he couldn't unsee the controlled power in her movements, the way she positioned herself to watch all entrance points, the subtle alertness that suggested she was still scanning for threats. The maitre approached his table apologetically. Judge Blackwell, please accept our deepest apologies for this incident. Your meal tonight is complimentary, of course, and we'd be honored to provide you with a private dining room for future visits. That won't be necessary, Antonio. I have no intention of changing my dining habits because of this unfortunate incident. But even as he spoke, Harrison felt the lie in his words. Everything had changed tonight. His comfortable assumptions about safety, about social hierarchy, about the people who moved invisibly through his privileged world, all of it lay in ruins, like the shattered crystal on Romano's floor. As he stood to leave, his tailored coat perfectly straight and his dignity intact, Harrison couldn't bring himself to approach Lucia directly. Instead, he left an envelope with Antonio containing a tip larger than most people's monthly salary, along with a brief note. Thank you for your exceptional service tonight. H.B. Lucia found the envelope an hour later as she finished helping close the restaurant. She stared at the note's formal language, the careful distance in its phrasing, and understood perfectly what it meant. Judge Harrison Blackwell was retreating behind his walls of wealth and position, determined to pretend tonight had been nothing more than an unfortunate incident that required proper compensation. The generous tip felt like a dismissal, a way to reduce her actions to a transaction that could be paid for and forgotten. She crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash, but kept the money. Her mother's medications were expensive and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. As she walked toward the subway station in the cool night air, Lucia told herself she was relieved. Harrison Blackwell was returning to his world, and she to hers. The dangerous moment of connection was over before it could complicate both their carefully ordered lives. But the ache in her chest suggested her heart hadn't received the message. 3 days after the attack at Romano's, Judge Harrison Blackwell sat in his mahogany-paneled chambers reviewing case files when his assistant knocked urgently on the door. "Judge, there's been a development in the Castellano case," Margaret Chen announced, her usually composed demeanor fractured with concern. "Detective Martinez is here with some disturbing news." The detective entered carrying a manila folder thick with photographs and reports. "Judge, we've identified your attackers. They're connected to Vincent Castellano's organization, just as we suspected. But there's more, they've escalated." Harrison removed his reading glasses, a chill settling in his chest. "They tried to grab your server from Romano's last night." Lucia Santos. 3 men waited outside her apartment building in Queens. Fortunately, she spotted the surveillance and evaded capture, but Judge Martinez paused, his expression grave. "They know she can identify them. More importantly, they know she's the reason their intimidation attempt failed." The pen in Harrison's hand snapped between his fingers. "Is she safe?" "For now. But she can't go home, can't return to work, can't follow her normal routines. These people don't leave loose ends. And she's become a very dangerous loose end." Martinez leaned forward. "Judge, I need you to understand something. Miss Santos isn't just a witness anymore. She's a target because she protected you." The weight of responsibility crashed over Harrison like a physical blow. This woman, who'd risked everything to save his life, was now in danger because of his enemies. His carefully maintained distance suddenly felt not just selfish, but morally indefensible. Where is she now? Safe house in Brooklyn. But Judge, there's a complication. The federal marshals are stretched thin with 3 other high-profile cases. They can only provide protection for 48 hours before she'll need to be relocated to a more permanent witness protection scenario. Witness protection. Harrison stood abruptly, pacing to the window overlooking Foley Square. For how long? Could be months. Could be years. These organizations have long memories and longer reach. The irony wasn't lost on Harrison. His judicial decisions, made from the safety of his elevated bench, regularly destroyed lives and reshaped destinies. But this was different. This was personal responsibility for someone who'd sacrificed her safety for his. "I want to see her," he said quietly. "Judge, I'm not sure that's—" Detective Martinez. Harrison's voice carried the authority that had commanded courtrooms for 2 decades. "That woman saved my life. The least I can do is look her in the eye and acknowledge the cost of that heroism." 2 hours later, Harrison found himself in a nondescript Brooklyn row house, its windows covered with heavy curtains and its modest interior watched over by 2 federal marshals. The contrast to his usual environment, marble lobbies, crystal chandeliers, mahogany furnishings, couldn't have been starker. Lucia sat at a small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. She'd changed from her server's uniform into jeans and a simple sweater, and without the professional polish, she looked younger, more vulnerable, but also somehow more authentically herself. When she looked up and saw Harrison entering with Detective Martinez, her expression hardened. "What's he doing here?" she asked the detective, pointedly not addressing Harrison directly. "Miss Santos, Judge Blackwell insisted on checking on your welfare," Martinez replied diplomatically. How considerate. Her tone could have frozen coffee. "I'm sure his conscience is much relieved now that he's confirmed I'm adequately warehoused." Harrison winced at the accuracy of her assessment. "Miss Santos, I came to what? Thank me again? Offer another generous tip?" She stood, her movements sharp with contained anger. "Judge, you made your position very clear with that note. This is a transaction to you. I performed a service, you paid for it. End of business relationship." The marshals exchanged glances and retreated to give them space, but remained within earshot. Detective Martinez busied himself reviewing files at the counter. "You're angry," Harrison observed. "I'm realistic." Lucia crossed her arms. "You're uncomfortable that someone like me saw you vulnerable, so you're trying to restore the proper social distance. I understand completely. What I don't understand is why you're here now." Her directness stripped away his usual diplomatic language. "Because you're in danger because of me." "No, I'm in danger because I made a choice. My choice. My consequences. A choice you made to save my life. A choice I made because it was right." Her voice softened slightly. "Not because you're special, Judge Blackwell. Because you're human, and humans shouldn't be hurt if I can prevent it. Have you ever had to depend on someone completely different from you during a crisis? What did you learn about yourself in that situation? I'm curious about your experiences with unexpected partnerships." The simple humanity of her statement hit him harder than any accusation could have. Harrison sank into the chair across from her, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "Do what? Be grateful. Be in someone's debt. Especially someone He stopped, the words tangling in his throat. "Someone you what, Judge?" "Someone I dismissed. Someone I never really saw, despite months of you serving my table." The confession tasted bitter. "I lived in a bubble where my money and position made me feel safe, superior. You shattered that bubble in 3 minutes." Lucia's expression softened marginally. "So you decided to rebuild it?" "Yes. And now my cowardice has put you in an impossible situation." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of truth settling between them. Outside, Brooklyn traffic hummed past the safe house, carrying people to ordinary lives that neither of them could claim right now. "The marshals say you might need witness protection," Harrison said finally. "For months, maybe years." Lucia's voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. "New identity, new life, no contact with anyone from my current existence, including your mother." Her composure finally cracked. "She's in assisted living. Early-stage dementia. I'm all she has left, and soon she won't even remember why I stopped visiting." Harrison made a decision that would change both their lives. "No," he said firmly, "that's not acceptable. There has to be another way. Judge, these aren't legal problems you can solve with judicial rulings." "Maybe not. But I'm not letting you disappear into witness protection because you saved my life." He leaned forward, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised them both. "We're going to figure this out together." Lucia stared at him, searching his face for the casual dismissal she expected. Instead, she found something she hadn't seen from him before: genuine determination to stand beside her rather than above her. "Together?" she asked quietly. "If you'll have me." For the first time since the attack at Romano's, Lucia Santos smiled, not her professional server's smile but something real and cautiously hopeful. Outside the safe house, night was falling over Brooklyn, and inside, two people from different worlds began the delicate process of building trust in the shadow of shared danger. The safe house settled into an uneasy routine over the next 18 hours. Harrison had insisted on staying, much to the marshal's bewilderment and Detective Martinez's concern. He'd sent his driver away and canceled his court appearances, claiming a family emergency that wasn't entirely untrue. He was beginning to understand that family had less to do with blood than with the people willing to stand beside you when everything collapsed. Lucia found him at dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with legal pads covered in notes, his silver hair disheveled from a sleepless night spent researching organized crime prosecution strategies and witness protection protocols. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly, pouring coffee from the pot the marshals had started hours earlier. "Yes, I do." He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but determined. "I've spent the night reviewing every Castellano case file, every connection, every legal precedent. There has to be a way to neutralize the threat without destroying your life." Lucia sat across from him, studying his earnest expression. "You still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? Then explain it to me." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "My full name is Captain Lucia Elena Santos, former U.S. Army Special Forces, decorated veteran of Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. I spent 12 years in military intelligence and special operations before." She stopped, her voice catching. "Before what?" "Before I made a choice that ended my career and nearly destroyed my life." She met his eyes directly. 8 years ago, I was part of a joint task force investigating arms smuggling from a defense contractor to insurgent groups overseas. We discovered the operation went all the way to Pentagon leadership, generals, defense officials, people who could end careers with a phone call. Harrison leaned forward, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. "You were ordered to bury the investigation. Worse, I was ordered to alter evidence to implicate a lower-level scapegoat, a good man with a family who would have spent his life in prison for crimes he didn't commit." Her voice hardened. "I refused. I took the evidence to internal affairs, to military justice, even to Congress." "What happened?" "Nothing. The investigation disappeared. The evidence vanished. The scapegoat died in a convenient car accident before he could testify. And Captain Lucia Santos was quietly drummed out of the service with a psych evaluation that suggested she was unstable, delusional, potentially dangerous." The pieces clicked together in Harrison's mind. "They destroyed your credibility so no one would believe your accusations." "Completely. My security clearance was revoked, my service record sealed, my commendations disappeared. Officially, I served 8 years in supply logistics. Boring, unremarkable, forgettable. Lucia's laugh held no humor. I went from being a decorated special operations officer to being unhireable for anything requiring a background check. But you saved that man's life. His family never knew. He never knew. I lost everything, career, pension, identity, future, to save someone who died anyway. 3 months later, her voice broke slightly. Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you can afford to pay. Harrison reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The gesture surprised them both. He wasn't a man comfortable with physical comfort, and she wasn't used to accepting it. "That's why you became invisible," he said softly. "It wasn't just about finding work. It was about staying safe. People with my knowledge and my skill set, who cross the wrong authorities, tend to have accidents. Car crashes, muggings gone wrong, mysterious illnesses." She didn't pull her hand away. Lucia Santos, the maid, was the perfect disguise: overlook, underestimated, harmless. Until you had to choose again. Between your safety and my life. History repeating itself, she agreed. Apparently, I'm not very good at learning from my mistakes. Have you ever sacrificed something important for a principle, even when no one would know or appreciate it? I'm interested in hearing about times when doing right came with a heavy personal cost. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, processing her story. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I've spent 30 years on the bench, believing that justice was about applying law correctly, following procedure, maintaining order. I thought my job was to be impartial, elevated above the messy human complications." He looked at their joined hands. "But you've shown me what real justice looks like. It's not about rules, it's about choosing to protect people even when it costs you everything. And what has your justice cost you, Harrison?" The use of his first name felt natural, intimate in a way that surprised neither of them. He considered deflecting, maintaining his professional distance, but her honesty demanded reciprocal truth. "Everything that mattered," he said finally. "My wife Margaret died 2 years ago. Cancer. She spent the last 6 months begging me to retire, to travel with her, to choose our life together over my career. I told her the court needed me, that my cases were too important to abandon." Lucia squeezed his hand gently. "You were afraid, terrified. My identity, my self-worth, my entire sense of purpose was tied to that bench. Without it, who was I? Just an old man who'd spent decades hiding behind robes and gavels instead of living." His voice cracked. "She died while I was in court, sentencing a drug dealer to 20 years. My assistant had to interrupt the proceedings to tell me my wife was gone. Harrison, the last thing she said to me was that she understood why I chose the law over her, because the law couldn't disappoint me the way love could. It couldn't leave me, couldn't die, couldn't require me to be vulnerable." Tears he'd held back for 2 years finally fell. She was right. I chose safety over love, control over connection. And it cost me the only person who ever really saw me. They sat in silence as the morning sun streamed through the safe house windows, two people who'd sacrificed everything for their principles discovering that perhaps they didn't have to face the consequences alone. "We're quite a pair," Lucia said eventually, "the disgraced soldier and the emotionally paralyzed judge. Both of us experts at making noble choices that destroy our own lives. Both of us running from the thing we need most. Which is?" Lucia looked at him directly, her brown eyes holding depths he was only beginning to understand. "Someone who sees our scars and chooses to stay anyway." Outside, Detective Martinez was arguing with the federal marshals about extended protection protocols. Inside, two wounded souls began the tentative process of believing they might be worthy of healing, and of each other. By the second evening in the safe house, the federal marshals had established a routine that gave Harrison and Lucia unexpected privacy. Marshal Rodriguez took the night shift, while Marshal Thompson handled days, and Detective Martinez checked in every few hours by phone. The small house began to feel less like protective custody and more like an unlikely sanctuary. Harrison had abandoned his usual formal attire for casual clothes borrowed from the Marshalls, khakis and a simple button-down that made him look younger, more approachable. Lucia had let her hair down from its perpetual bun, and without her server's uniform, she moved with the confident grace of the soldier she'd once been. They'd spent the day working together, Harrison using his legal expertise to map prosecution strategies, while Lucia provided tactical insight about how criminal organizations operated. But as darkness fell, their conversation shifted from strategy to something more personal. "Tell me about Margaret," Lucia said as they sat together on the small couch, sharing takeout Chinese food from containers balanced on their laps. "What was she like when you weren't hiding behind your judicial armor?" Harrison smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern features. "Brilliant. Funny. Completely unimpressed by my accomplishments." He set down his chopsticks, lost in memory. "She was a pediatric surgeon, saved children's lives every day, and came home acting like it was just another job. Meanwhile, I'd spend 20 minutes describing the legal precedent I'd established in some property dispute. She sounds wonderful." She had this laugh, completely uninhibited, joyful. "The first time I heard it, I was giving a lecture at Columbia Law School. She was auditing the class, and I made some pompous comment about judicial dignity. She laughed so hard she snorted, and half the students started laughing too." His eyes brightened with the memory. "I was mortified at the time, but afterward she approached me and said, 'Professor Blackwell, has anyone ever told you that you're much more interesting when you stop trying to be impressive?'" Lucia grinned. "I like her already. How long were you married?" 28 years. She proposed to me, you know. I was taking forever to work up the courage, analyzing the decision like a legal brief. So one evening she just looked at me over dinner and said, 'Harrison, I love you and I want to marry you. Stop overthinking it and give me an answer.' What did you say?" "Yes, obviously. But first I explained why marriage was a complex legal and emotional commitment that required careful consideration of compatibility factors." "Oh no, you didn't." She kissed me quiet. Best legal argument I ever lost. They laughed together, the sound filling the small space with warmth. Lucia curled her legs under herself, leaning closer to him on the couch. "What about you?" Harrison asked. "Ever come close to marriage?" Lucia's expression grew wistful. "Once. His name was David Chen, ironically, a lawyer like you. We met when I was stationed at Fort Bragg. He was doing JAG work, military legal services. What happened? The same thing that always happened to military relationships. Deployments, distance, different priorities." She paused, then continued more softly. "But truthfully, I never let him close enough to really know me. I was so focused on being the perfect soldier, proving I belonged in special ops, that I forgot how to be just Lucia. Do you regret it?" "I regret a lot of things. But mostly, I regret all the years I spent being afraid to be vulnerable with someone." She looked at him directly. "Fear makes us stupid, doesn't it? We think we're protecting ourselves, but we're just building prettier prisons." Harrison reached over, tucking a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. The gesture was gentle, tentative, and she leaned into his touch. "I've been in prison for 2 years, he admitted. Ever since Margaret died, I've been going through the motions of living while feeling completely dead inside. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. No joy, no connection, no hope that life could be anything more than just endurance. And now I'm terrified," he said honestly, "because sitting here with you talking like this, I feel alive again. And I don't know if I'm brave enough to handle that. When you've been emotionally closed off, what makes you finally open up to someone? I'd love to hear about moments when unexpected connection broke through your walls." Lucia shifted closer, close enough that he could smell her subtle perfume, see the golden flecks in her brown eyes. Harrison, can I tell you something that might sound crazy? After the last 3 days, I'm pretty sure my definition of crazy has been permanently recalibrated. In all my years of military service, through combat and dangerous missions, I never felt as safe as I do right now. Sitting in a safe house, hunted by criminals, with no idea what tomorrow will bring, and I feel safer than I have in years. Why? Because you see me. Not the decorated soldier, not the invisible maid, not the dangerous woman who can fight. You see, Lucia, just me. And you're still here. He cupped her face gently in his hands. Of course I'm still here. You're remarkable, Lucia. You're brave and brilliant and beautiful, and you saved my life in more ways than you know. You saved mine too, she whispered. You gave me a reason to stop hiding. They were inches apart now, the air between them charged with possibility. Harrison's thumb traced her cheekbone, and Lucia's eyes fluttered closed at the tender touch. I don't know how to do this, he murmured. It's been so long since I've felt anything. We'll figure it out together, she replied, echoing his words from the day before. We don't have to be perfect at it. When he kissed her, it was soft and hesitant at first, like someone remembering how to breathe after being underwater. But as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck, the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate and full of 2 years of loneliness finally finding solace. They broke apart breathlessly, foreheads touching, and for the first time in either of their lives, the future felt like something worth fighting for. Whatever happens tomorrow, Harrison said quietly, I want you to know that these 3 days with you have been the most honest, most alive I've felt in decades. Tomorrow we figure out how to build a life together. Lucia replied firmly. I'm done running, Harrison. From them, from my past, from this. She gestured between them. I want to fight for us. Then we fight, he agreed, pulling her closer. Together. Outside the safe house, Brooklyn settled into sleep, but inside, 2 hearts that had been closed for years finally dared to hope for love at last. The gunshots shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 4:17 a.m. Harrison jolted awake on the safe house couch where he'd fallen asleep, holding Lucia, her head nestled against his shoulder. The sharp crack of automatic weapons fire from outside sent ice through his veins, followed immediately by Marshal Rodriguez's urgent voice from his radio position by the front window. We've got multiple vehicles, armed hostiles approaching from both ends of the street. This location is compromised. Lucia was already moving before she was fully awake, her military training kicking in instantly. She rolled off the couch and low-crawled toward the window, staying below the sightline while assessing the tactical situation. How many? She called to Rodriguez, who was frantically radioing for backup. At least 8, maybe 10. Professional formation, coordinated approach. These aren't street thugs, this is a military-style assault. More gunfire erupted. Closer now. The safe house windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Harrison instinctively dove toward Lucia, his only thought protecting her, but she was already moving with deadly efficiency. Harrison, stay down. She grabbed the backup pistol from Rodriguez's tactical bag. How long until backup arrives? Minimum 15 minutes. Rodriguez replied grimly, returning fire through the shattered window. We need to evacuate now. Back exit? Lucia asked. Covered. They've got the house surrounded. Rodriguez's voice carried the flat acceptance of a professional recognizing impossible odds. Ma'am, you need to know they're not here to take prisoners. This is a termination operation. The words hit Harrison like physical blows. These men hadn't come to kidnap or intimidate, they'd come to execute both him and Lucia, eliminating the threat they represented to the Castellano organization permanently. A new voice boomed from outside, amplified by a bullhorn. Judge Blackwell, you have 30 seconds to send out the woman, and we'll make your death quick. Otherwise we start with the marshals and work our way up. Lucia's face went white. They're not here for you, she said quietly, the pieces clicking into place. They're here for me. You were never the real target, Harris. What are you talking about? Think about it. Why attack you in a restaurant full of witnesses? Why give you days of warning with police protection? Her voice carried the terrible certainty of someone seeing the trap too late. They wanted to flush me out. They needed me to reveal my skills, to become visible, to lead them to exactly where I am right now. Rodriguez looked between them, his expression grim. Ma'am, what aren't you telling us? Lucia closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with resignation. The arms smuggling investigation I told you about, the one that ended my career? Vincent Castellano was the primary defense contractor. His organization wasn't just connected to the weapons trafficking, they were running it. Harrison felt the world tilt. You can identify him as the head of an international arms smuggling operation. Worse than that. I have evidence. Hidden, documented, ironclad evidence that could bring down not just Castellano but half the Pentagon officials who covered it up. Her voice broke. I've been sitting on it for 8 years, too scared to use it, too paranoid to destroy it. Jesus Christ, Rodriguez breathed. You're not just a witness to restaurant assault, you're the key to bringing down a billion-dollar criminal enterprise. The bullhorn crackled again. 20 seconds, Judge. The woman comes out, or everyone dies. Have you ever discovered that someone you cared about had been hiding something that put you both in danger? How did it change your feelings about them? I'm curious about your experiences with trust and revelation. Harrison stared at Lucia, his mind reeling. Everything, the attack at Romano's, her protection of him, even their growing connection, had been built on lies. Not malicious deception, but lies nonetheless. You've known all along, he said quietly. You knew they weren't really after me. Harrison, you knew, and you let me believe I was protecting you. You let me feel responsible for your danger when really, I was just collateral damage in your war. It wasn't like that. Lucia protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Wasn't it? His judicial mind was dissecting the timeline with cold precision. You've been carrying evidence that could destroy these people for 8 years. You knew who they were the moment they approached my table. You saved me not because you cared about some stranger, but because you needed to protect your cover. 10 seconds. The voice outside had turned savage. Rodriguez was positioned at the window, weapon ready. I can't hold them off alone. We need a decision now. Lucia looked between the marshal and Harrison, her face a mask of anguish. There's a third option, she said quietly. I go out there alone. I offer them a trade. My life for proof that the evidence dies with me. Absolutely not, Harrison said immediately. It's the only way to save you. Both of you. Lucia. No, Harrison. Listen to me. She grabbed his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Everything I told you about my past was true. Everything I felt with you these last 3 days was real. The only lie was letting you believe you were responsible for my situation. 5 seconds. But I am responsible, Harrison said desperately. Not for creating your danger, but for caring about you. For wanting to build something with you. That makes me responsible for keeping you alive. Tears streamed down her face. You don't understand. I'm not the woman you think I am. I'm not some innocent server who got caught up in your problems. I'm a trained killer carrying evidence that threatens national security. People like me don't get happy endings with people like you. Time's up. The voice outside roared. The front door exploded inward under the force of a tactical breach charge. Smoke grenades rolled across the floor, filling the safe house with choking gray fog. Red laser sights cut through the haze like deadly fireflies. Go, Rodriguez shouted, laying down covering fire as armed figures poured through the breach. Lucia made her choice in that split second. She kissed Harrison once, desperately, then shoved him toward the back of the house. Run. Forget about me. Forget everything. Lucia, no! But she was already moving toward the front door, her hands raised, walking into the gunfire and smoke to surrender herself to save his life. Harrison watched the woman he'd fallen in love with disappear into the chaos, her sacrifice as devastating as it was selfless. The last thing he saw was her silhouette against the muzzle flashes before Rodriguez dragged him toward the rear exit, leaving his heart behind in the burning safe house. Everything they'd built together, trust, hope, love, lay shattered in the ruins of her deception and his doubt. Harrison Blackwell sat in the back of the federal agent's unmarked sedan, staring at his hands while the Brooklyn safe house burned behind them. Marshal Rodriguez had gotten him out through the back alley during the firefight, but the victory felt hollow. They'd escaped with their lives, but Lucia was gone. "Judge, we need to get you to a secure location immediately," Agent Sarah Vance, from the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, was saying, but her words seemed to come from underwater. "The Castellano organization clearly has resources and intelligence capabilities we underestimated." "What happened to her?" Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. "Miss Santos." Agent Vance checked her tablet. "Preliminary reports suggest she was taken alive. Given her value as a witness with potential evidence, they'll want to interrogate her before." She stopped, reading Harrison's expression. "Before they kill her," he finished. The sedan pulled into the parking garage of a federal building in Lower Manhattan. Harrison followed the agents mechanically, his mind replaying the last 3 days in fragments. Lucia's laugh over Chinese takeout, the way she'd touched his face, her final kiss before walking into gunfire to save his life. "Judge, we need to discuss your options," Agent Vance continued as they rode the elevator to the 20th floor. "Given Miss Santos's capture and the evidence she claimed to possess, this situation has escalated to national security levels. We can place you in witness protection until—" "No." Harrison's voice cut through her professional efficiency. "I want to see Deputy Director Morrison now." "Sir, that's not—" "Agent Vance, I've presided over federal cases for 20 years. I know exactly how this bureaucracy works, and I know that somewhere in this building is someone with the authority to mount a rescue operation." His judicial authority reasserted itself. "Get me that person, or I start making phone calls to every senator, cabinet member and Supreme Court justice in my contacts list." 2 hours later, Harrison sat across from Deputy Director Frank Morrison in a conference room filled with tactical maps, surveillance photos and case files. Morrison was a career FBI veteran with gray hair and tired eyes, who'd spent 30 years fighting organized crime. "Judge Blackwell, I'll be direct with you," Morrison began. "Lucia Santos is being held at a warehouse complex in Queens. We have surveillance confirming her location, but any rescue attempt would be extremely high risk." "What kind of risk?" "The facility is heavily fortified, multiple armed guards, sophisticated security systems. Even with a full tactical team, casualties would be likely, and that includes Miss Santos." Harrison studied the surveillance photos showing the warehouse compound. "What about her evidence, the arms trafficking documentation she mentioned?" Morrison's expression grew grave. "If it exists, and if it's as damaging as she claimed, it could implicate dozens of military and government officials. The kind of evidence that could destabilize defense contracts worth billions of dollars. Someone in the government wants her dead." Harrison realized. "Judge, I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Harrison stood, pacing to the window overlooking the city. "How long does she have?" "Best estimate, they'll interrogate her for 12 to 18 hours, trying to locate the evidence. After that—" Morrison didn't finish the sentence. Harrison turned back to the conference table, his mind working through possibilities with the same analytical precision he applied to complex legal cases. "What if I could give you probable cause for a federal raid on that warehouse?" "Sir, I'm a sitting federal judge. If I personally witnessed crimes being committed at that location, if I had direct knowledge of federal statutes being violated, that would constitute grounds for immediate law enforcement action." Morrison leaned forward. "Judge, what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that I have a constitutional obligation to ensure that justice is served." If that means putting myself at risk to gather evidence of federal crimes in progress, Harrison met the deputy director's eyes. I took an oath to defend justice, Deputy Director. I intend to honor that oath. When someone you love is in danger, how far would you go to save them? What principles would you compromise? What risks would you take? I'd love to hear your thoughts on love versus safety. 3 hours later, as the sun set over Queens, Harrison sat in the passenger seat of an unmarked surveillance van parked 2 blocks from the warehouse complex. He wore a bulletproof vest under his suit jacket and carried a wire transmitter that would broadcast everything he witnessed to the federal tactical team positioned nearby. Agent Martinez, the detective who'd first interviewed him at Romano's, sat beside him with obvious disapproval. "Judge, this is insane. You're not trained for this kind of operation. You're 62 years old, for Christ's sake." "Detective, 48 hours ago, I thought I was a lonely old man whose life had no meaning beyond legal precedent," Harrison replied quietly. "That woman in there taught me what courage really looks like. She risked everything to save my life, then sacrificed herself to save it again. And if she was lying to you about everything, if she manipulated you from the beginning?" Harrison considered the question that had been tormenting him since the safe house. "Then I'll still love her. Because the woman who held me while I talked about Margaret, who shared her pain about losing her career, who kissed me like I was worth saving, that woman was real, regardless of what she was hiding." He checked his watch. "Besides, Detective, I spent my entire marriage hiding behind my work instead of fighting for the person I loved. I won't make that mistake twice." The radio crackled. "All units, target is moving. Judge, if you're going to do this, it has to be now." Harrison stepped out of the van, straightening his tie with hands that trembled only slightly. The warehouse loomed ahead, surrounded by chain-link fence and floodlights. Somewhere inside, Lucia was fighting for her life while he'd spent hours questioning whether she deserved his help. The answer, he realized, wasn't about what she deserved. It was about what love demanded from him. He walked toward the warehouse gates, knowing that in the next hour he would either save the woman he loved or die trying. For the first time in his life, that felt like the only choice worth making. Behind him, federal agents prepared for the most dangerous rescue operation of their careers, led by a judge who'd finally learned the difference between legal justice and moral courage. The choice was made. Now came the reckoning. The warehouse security guard barely looked up when Judge Harrison Blackwell approached the main gate, his expensive suit and authoritative bearing suggesting legitimate business even at this late hour. "I'm here to see Vincent Castellano," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the judicial authority that had commanded courtrooms for 2 decades. "Tell him Judge Blackwell is here to discuss terms." The guard spoke into his radio, and within minutes, the gates opened. Harrison walked into the complex, knowing that federal agents were positioned around the perimeter, waiting for his signal, but also knowing that Lucia's life depended entirely on his ability to buy them time. Inside the main warehouse, Vincent Castellano waited, a silver-haired man in his 60s whose expensive suit couldn't quite hide the predator underneath. He was flanked by 6 armed men, and in the center of the vast space, tied to a metal chair under harsh fluorescent lights, was Lucia. She'd been beaten, her face bruised and her lips split, but her eyes blazed with unbroken defiance. When she saw Harrison enter, her expression shifted to desperate horror. "Harrison? No!" she called out before one of the guards backhanded her to silence. Castellano smiled coldly. "Judge Blackwell, how thoughtful of you to join us. Though I must admit, I'm surprised. Most men in your position would have disappeared into witness protection by now." "Most men haven't fallen in love with someone worth dying for," Harrison replied, his eyes locked on Lucia's. In that moment, all his doubts, all his questions about deception and manipulation, evaporated. Whatever games had been played, whatever truths had been hidden, the woman tied to that chair was the same one who'd held him through his grief and shown him how to live again. How touching. "Unfortunately, your romantic gesture is pointless. Miss Santos has been most uncooperative regarding the location of certain documents that belong to me. The arms trafficking evidence, Harrison said. She doesn't have it anymore. Castellano's eyes narrowed. Explain. She gave it to me 3 days ago, when she realized you were closing in. Harrison reached slowly into his jacket pocket, producing a flash drive. 12 years of documentation. Military contracts, weapons serial numbers, payment records, communications with Pentagon officials. It was a lie, of course. Harrison had no idea where Lucia's evidence was hidden, if it even existed, but he was gambling that Castellano's greed and desperation would overcome his caution. Give it to me, Castellano demanded. First, let her go. Castellano laughed. Judge, you're hardly in a position to negotiate terms. Actually, I am. Harrison's voice carried the calm certainty of a man who'd found his courage at last. Because that flash drive is encrypted with military-grade security that requires both our biometric signatures to access. Kill either of us, and the information becomes worthless. Another lie, but delivered with the conviction of 2 decades on the bench. Harrison watched Castellano's expression shift as greed warred with suspicion. You're bluffing, am I? You've spent 8 years hunting this evidence, killed people to protect the secrets it contains. Are you willing to gamble everything on whether I'm telling the truth? When you finally find the courage to fight for someone you love, what does that moment feel like? I'm curious about your experiences with putting everything on the line for another person. The standoff stretched for long seconds. Then Castellano nodded to one of his men who moved toward Lucia's chair. Harrison tensed, ready to give the signal that would bring the federal agents crashing through every entrance. But before the man could reach Lucia, she acted. The chair she'd been tied to wasn't just restraining her, she'd been working at her bonds for hours, using techniques learned in survival training. When the guard bent to untie her, she snapped the loosened rope and drove her elbow into his throat, dropping him instantly. In the chaos that followed, Harrison dove for cover behind a steel shipping container while Lucia rolled away from the lights, disappearing into the warehouse's maze of equipment and shadows. Gunfire erupted as Castellano's men tried to track her movement, but she was no longer the helpless victim they'd been interrogating. She was Captain Lucia Santos, and she was done being anyone's prisoner. Now, Harrison shouted into his wire transmitter. The warehouse exploded with activity as federal tactical teams breached from 6 different entry points. Flashbang grenades turned the space into strobing chaos, while Harrison pressed himself against the shipping container, praying that Lucia could stay alive long enough for the cavalry to reach her. Through the gunfire and shouting, he heard Castellano's voice. Find the woman, kill them both. Then, impossibly, Harrison heard something else. Lucia's voice, calm and deadly. Vincent Castellano, you're under arrest for arms trafficking, conspiracy, and about a dozen federal weapons charges. Harrison peered around the container to see Lucia standing behind Castellano, having somehow circled through the warehouse maze to approach him from behind. She held one of the fallen guard's weapons pressed against the crime boss's neck while federal agents secured the perimeter. The evidence you've been looking for? Lucia continued conversationally. I uploaded it to 7 different news organizations and 3 Senate Intelligence Committees yesterday, with instructions to publish if I didn't check in by midnight tonight. You never had a chance to stop it. As federal agents placed Castellano in custody and secured the warehouse, Harrison emerged from his hiding place. Lucia met him halfway across the concrete floor, and when she fell into his arms, everything else, the danger, the deception, the fear, became irrelevant. Are you hurt? He asked, touching her bruised face gently. I'm perfect, she replied. Then kissed him with the desperate relief of someone who'd never expected to see tomorrow. Lucia, about what you said in the safe house, about lying to me. Harrison, stop. She pressed her fingers to his lips. I kept secrets, yes, but I never lied about this. She gestured between them. about how I feel, about what you mean to me, about wanting to build something real with you. Even though I'm a privileged judge, who hid behind his work for 30 years, especially because you're a man brave enough to walk into a criminal stronghold to save someone who deceived you." Her smile was radiant, despite her injuries. "Besides, I happen to love privileged judges who've learned how to put their hearts before their careers." 6 months later, Harrison Blackwell retired from the federal bench to marry Lucia Santos in a small ceremony attended by Detective Martinez, Deputy Director Morrison, and a handful of other friends who'd learned that sometimes the most important cases aren't decided in courtrooms but in moments when two people choose love over fear. They honeymooned in the Dominican Republic, where Harrison met Lucia's mother and learned to dance merengue badly but enthusiastically. Lucia enrolled in law school. Her military benefits had finally been restored after her testimony brought down the arms trafficking ring, while Harrison discovered that retirement meant having time to fall in love with his wife all over again. Every single day. And sometimes on quiet evenings in their Brooklyn brownstone, they would remember the night at Romano's, when 5 dangerous men learned that the most powerful force in the world isn't violence or money or fear. It's love, finally found and fiercely defended, between two people brave enough to see each other's scars and choose to stay anyway. What's your definition of true love? Is it finding someone perfect, or finding someone whose imperfections complement your own? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what makes love last.
The end. Harrison and Lucia found their love at last, overcoming deception, danger, and their own fears to build something real and lasting. Thank you for letting me tell their emotional journey from that first moment at Romano's to their happily ever after in Brooklyn. If this story gripped you, wait until you see the next one. It's even more shocking and unforgettable. Tap the image on your screen now to watch it. And thank you for staying with me till the very end.